Ever ordered something cool online, like a new gadget or something?
Ah.
And then when it arrives, you get hit with like a surprise fee?
Yeah.
Well, my friend, that is tariffs at work.
Uh-huh.
And today we're going on a deep dive into this kind of hidden world of tariffs, how they work, why countries use them, and how they can really impact you, even if you don't know a lot about economics.
Right.
So for this deep dive, we've got two main guides. We've got a big picture overview from the Council on Foreign Relations, and then a more U.S.-focused analysis from the Tax Foundation.
Okay.
So by the time we're done, you'll be able to hold your own in any debate about tariffs,
Yeah.
whether it's at the dinner table or in the boardroom. So first things first, what exactly are we talking about when we say tariffs?
Well, at their core, tariffs are simply taxes on goods that are coming from other countries.
Okay.
You can almost think of them as little border checkpoints where governments can collect extra cash on imports.
Okay, that makes sense. But why would a country want to do that? It seems like it would just make things more expensive for everybody.
Well, it does make things more expensive. And that's often the point.
Yeah, right.
Governments will use tariffs for a variety of reasons. To make money, to protect their own industries, and even sometimes to try and influence other countries' behavior.
So it's not just about getting that extra cash.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Imagine a country where local businesses are struggling to compete with really cheap imports from other countries. A tariff can kind of act as a shield to make those imports more expensive.
Right.
And give the local products a fighting chance.
Oh, so it's kind of like giving local businesses a boost.
Yeah.
But what about when countries accuse each other of unfair trade practices? How do tariffs play into that?
That's where it gets even more strategic. Let's say, for example, a country suspects another country of dumping goods, which means selling them for way below cost to try and squeeze out the competition.
Oh.
They might use what's called an anti-dumping tariff to kind of counter that move.
So tariffs can be used as a way to enforce fair play in the global marketplace.
Exactly. The U.S., for example, has used this tactic against China, claiming unfair practices around intellectual property. And they actually use what's called Section 301 to justify tariffs on a whole range of Chinese goods.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm starting to see how complicated this can get.
Yeah.
But there's one thing I'm really curious about. Who actually pays these tariffs? Is it the foreign companies? Or do we, the consumers, end up footing the bill?
That's the million-dollar question. And that's where it gets really interesting for your wallet.
Okay.
While importers do initially pay the tariff, they often pass that cost along, like a hot potato.
So it's like a ripple effect.
Exactly.
Okay.
Importers will raise their prices to cover the tariff, and suddenly that cool gadget you ordered online costs more.
Right.
Sometimes foreign companies will eat some of the cost to stay competitive.
Right.
But often it's you, the consumer, who ends up paying the price.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I gotta admit, it's kind of a bummer.
Yeah.
It makes me think about all this talk about tariffs during the Trump and Biden administrations. It felt like there was a tariff war brewing every other week.
It was definitely a period of heightened tariff activity, and it sparked a lot of debate. Both presidents used tariffs pretty extensively, targeting everything from steel to washing machines.
So what was the goal? Were they trying to protect American jobs? Or were they trying to punish other countries?
Well, it was kind of a mix of motives. They talked about protecting American jobs, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., and addressing trade imbalances. But the reality is that these tariffs often ended up hurting American consumers and businesses more than they helped.
Wait, so tariffs that were meant to help the U.S. economy actually ended up backfiring?
Well, the impact was definitely complex, and there were definitely some unintended consequences.
Okay.
Several studies showed that these tariffs led to higher prices for U.S. consumers and businesses. And in some cases, companies actually saw the tariffs as an opportunity to raise their prices even further.
Really?
Taking advantage of the situation to boost their profit.
Hold on. So not only were consumers paying for the tariff, but companies were sometimes adding even more on top of that.
Yeah. This is a phenomenon called overshifting. And in the case of washing machines, for example, consumers ended up paying an estimated $1.5 billion more than they would have without those tariffs.
Wow. That's a staggering figure. So you're telling me that my dream of a fancy new washing machine is even further out of reach thanks to tariffs?
It's definitely something to consider when you're making those big purchases.
Yeah.
And this raises an important question. Do tariffs actually achieve their goal of boosting domestic industries?
Right.
Or are they just a way to score political points?
That's what I'm dying to know.
Right.
Let's unpack that debate in our next segment. Okay, so we've established that tariffs can be kind of a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
They might protect some industries, but they can also lead to higher prices. And some unintended consequences for consumers.
Exactly. It's a really complex issue with no easy answers. And sometimes, instead of actually boosting domestic industries, tariffs can actually make them less competitive in the long run.
That's interesting. How does that work?
Well, think about it this way. If a company relies on imported components to make their products, tariffs on those components are going to drive up their costs, which makes it harder for them to compete with foreign companies who don't face those same tariffs.
Ah, I see. Like shooting yourself in the foot, trying to protect one industry while hurting another.
Yeah, it's a very delicate balancing act, and policymakers have to weigh the potential costs and benefits really carefully.
So if tariffs aren't always the best solution, what are some alternatives that countries can consider?
Well, one option is to focus on negotiating trade agreements that promote free and fair trade.
Oh.
Instead of using tariffs as weapons, countries can work together to reduce barriers to trade and create a more level playing field.
So more cooperation and less conflict.
Exactly. Organizations like the World Trade Organization, or WTO, play a crucial role in facilitating these agreements and resolving trade disputes.
That sounds like a much more collaborative approach.
It is. Another alternative is for governments to invest in policies that enhance domestic competitiveness. So things like education, infrastructure, research and development.
So instead of trying to protect industries from competition, governments can help them become more innovative and efficient.
Precisely. By investing in their own economies, countries can create an environment where businesses can thrive on a global scale.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about empowering businesses to compete, not shielding them from competition.
It's a long-term approach that focuses on building a strong and resilient economy.
Okay, so we've talked about the different ways countries can use tariffs.
Yeah.
And we've explored some alternatives. But all this talk about trade wars and economic policies can feel a bit overwhelming. How can we, as everyday citizens, make sense of it all? How can we cut through the noise and figure out what's really going on?
That's a great question. And it's more important than ever to be informed and engaged. First and foremost, be aware of your own biases.
Okay.
We all have them, and they can influence how we interpret information.
So take a step back and ask yourself, am I looking at this objectively? Or am I letting my own preconceived notions kind of cloud my judgment?
Exactly. It's also crucial to critically evaluate your sources of information.
Okay.
Who's behind the study or the article you're reading? What are their motivations and their potential biases?
So do your research and consider the source.
Precisely. And finally, don't be afraid to ask questions and challenge assumptions. The more you understand about the complexities of tariffs, the better equipped you'll be to navigate this ever-evolving landscape.
That's great advice. But let's be honest, sometimes it feels like economists and politicians speak a different language. Is there anything we can do to make this topic more accessible and relatable?
Absolutely. One helpful approach is to think about tariffs in the context of your own life.
Okay.
How do they impact the things you buy, the jobs in your community, or the overall health of the economy?
So connect the dots between the big picture and your own personal experiences.
Exactly. For example, remember that washing machine we talked about earlier? Think about how that tariff-induced price increase might impact a family that's trying to make ends meet.
That's a great point. It makes the issue much more tangible and real.
It does. Another helpful strategy is to look for historical examples that can shed light on current debates.
You mean like learning from the mistakes of the past?
Precisely. One of the most infamous examples is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
Oh, yeah.
Many economists believe that this protectionist policy, which raised tariffs on thousands of imported goods, actually deepened the Great Depression.
Wow. So a misguided attempt to protect American industries actually backfired and made the economic situation worse.
It's a stark reminder that tariffs can have unintended consequences, and that protectionism doesn't always lead to prosperity.
That's a sobering thought. But it also makes me wonder, if history is any guide, are we destined to repeat these mistakes? Are we on a path toward more protectionism? Or will countries find a way to cooperate and foster free trade?
That's a question that economists and policymakers are grappling with right now.
And it's a question that impacts all of us. Speaking of impact, let's shift gears and look at some specific examples of how tariffs are being used around the world today. We've been unpacking this whole world of tariffs, like why countries use them and the ripple effects they can cause, and even how they've played out in history.
Right.
But I'm kind of curious about the here and now. What are some examples of how tariffs are actually shaping the global economy today?
Well, we already touched on the U.S.-China trade war, which was a Pretty dramatic example of tariffs in action.
Yeah.
But there are plenty of other cases playing out right now. For instance, the European Union uses tariffs to protect its agricultural sector. It's a complex system of tariffs and quotas that are designed to shield European farmers from competition.
So even with all the talk about free trade, some regions still really rely on tariffs to protect their own interests.
Exactly. And it's not without controversy.
Right.
Critics argue that those EU tariffs make food more expensive for European consumers. But on the other hand, supporters say that it's vital to preserve farming livelihoods and ensure food security within the EU.
Yeah. It's a classic example of how tariffs can create winners and losers. And those trade-offs are never easy to navigate.
Absolutely. And it's not just developed economies that are using tariffs.
Okay.
Many developing countries see tariffs as a way to help their own industries grow.
So tariffs can be a tool for developing countries too, not just like big players like the US or the EU.
That's right. They might use tariffs to protect their fledgling industries from being overwhelmed by, more established foreign companies.
Yeah.
It's kind of like giving them a little bit of breathing room
Yeah.
to develop and become competitive on a global scale.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I imagine there's a risk that those industries might become too reliant on that protection and never really learn to compete.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act.
Right.
If tariffs stay in place for too long, they can stifle innovation and actually make those industries less efficient in the long run.
So finding that sweet spot between protection and competition is crucial.
It is. And as we've kind of discussed throughout this whole deep dive, there's always a political dimension to these decisions, too.
Right. Tariffs aren't just about economics. They can be really powerful political tools. Which reminds me, we talked earlier about the importance of being like critical consumers of information.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to something as complex as tariffs. So do you have any final words of wisdom to help us navigate this world of conflicting opinions and data?
Absolutely. Remember, tariffs are rarely a simple issue. Don't be swayed by those who offer easy answers or simplistic solutions.
So no quick fixes or magic bullets.
Exactly. And always be mindful of the source.
Yeah.
Who's presenting the information and what might be their agenda.
So do your homework. Check those sources.
Yeah.
And look for evidence-based analysis.
Right. And finally, don't be afraid to ask questions. Challenge assumptions. Dig deeper.
Yeah.
And form your own informed opinions.
Great advice. Well, it's been fascinating exploring this world of tariffs, unpacking the history, the economics, and the political maneuvering. I feel like I've gained a whole new level of understanding.
It's been a pleasure diving into this with you.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new and maybe even feel inspired to explore this topic further on your own. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world around you.